Karen Thompson was not the kind of person you'd expect to make international headlines. She was an ordinary woman in her late 30s, living a quiet life in a small suburban town in Ohio. Her days were filled with grocery runs, helping her teenage son prepare for soccer matches, and ticking off items from her never-ending to-do list. Karen loved routine, but every now and then she craved adventure. That's why, when her husband suggested they take a family vacation to London, she jumped at the idea. It wasn't just about seeing Big Ben or Buckingham Palace. It was her chance to step out of her comfort zone and experience something new. On their second day in London, Karen decided to explore the city on her own while her husband attended a work meeting and her son joined a local youth soccer clinic. Armed with a map, a bottle of water, and her trusty pepper spray, a habit she picked up after watching too many crime dramas, Karen set off toward Trafalgar Square. The square buzzed with energy. Tourists snapped photos, artists painted portraits, and street performers entertained crowds with magic tricks and acrobatics. Karen marveled at the grandeur of Nelson's Column towering above her, its intricate carvings telling stories of history she barely understood. As she wandered through the square, her eyes landed on a figure standing perfectly still against the chaos around him. It was one of Queen Elizabeth's royal guards, dressed head to toe in his iconic red tunic and towering bearskin hat. His posture was impeccable, chin up, shoulders back, hands clasped behind him. He looked like a statue come to life. Karen had seen pictures of these soldiers before, but seeing one up close felt surreal. People gathered around him, snapping selfies and pointing excitedly. Some even tried to get creative, making silly faces or striking poses beside him. But no matter what happened, the guard remained motionless, almost otherworldly. Karen found herself fascinated by the scene. She watched as children giggled uncontrollably, while parents urged them to stand straighter for the perfect photo op. A young couple kissed dramatically next to him, clearly trying to capture the most romantic picture ever. Others whispered among themselves, debating whether the guards were allowed to move or speak at all. For Karen, it was mesmerizing, a strange blend of tradition and modernity playing out right in front of her eyes. But as she stood there observing, her protective instincts began to kick in. She noticed a group of teenagers approaching the guard. They were loud, boisterous, and clearly enjoying themselves. One boy poked the guard's arm lightly, laughing hysterically when nothing happened. Another shouted random phrases like, "Hey, buddy, smile." Their antics drew chuckles from some bystanders, but Karen frowned. To her, it didn't seem funny. She imagined how uncomfortable the guard must feel, being poked and prodded like some sort of exhibit. Her mind raced with thoughts. Was this harassment? Did anyone care? Shouldn't someone intervene? Without realizing it, Karen tightened her grip on her purse. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal canister inside, the pepper spray she always carried just in case. At first, she hesitated, unsure if stepping in would be wise. But the more she thought about it, the angrier she became. This man was just doing his job, standing there silently, and here were these kids treating him like entertainment. Something inside her snapped. Before she could talk herself out of it, Karen made a decision that would change everything, for better or worse. Karen's heart was pounding as she stood there, her hand gripping the strap of her purse tightly. The teenagers around the royal guard were growing bolder by the second. They weren't just shouting silly phrases anymore. They were now circling him like predators testing their prey. One boy pretended to throw a punch toward the guard's face, stopping inches away with a laugh. Another mimicked his stiff posture, exaggerating every movement to make the crowd roar with amusement. Even some adults nearby chuckled at the spectacle, recording videos on their phones instead of stepping in to stop it. To Karen, this wasn't harmless fun. It felt cruel. She couldn't shake the image of the guard standing there, silent and stoic, while people poked, shouted, and mocked him. In her mind, he wasn't just a symbol of tradition or a tourist attraction. He was a human being, How could anyone treat another person this way? Her protective instincts, honed over years of motherhood and caring for others, kicked into overdrive. She imagined herself in his shoes, or rather, his shiny black boots, and felt a surge of anger mixed with pity. Her thoughts spiraled quickly. What if the guard couldn't move because of strict rules? What if he wanted to retaliate but feared losing his job? Worse still, what if these kids kept pushing boundaries until something dangerous happened? Karen had read enough news stories about situations escalating out of control. Someone needed to step up, and no one else seemed willing to do it. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Karen reached into her purse and pulled out the pepper spray. It was small, compact, and fit snugly in her palm. A tool she carried everywhere just in case. She never thought she'd actually use it, especially not here in broad daylight surrounded by hundreds of tourists. But in that moment, logic took a backseat to emotion. All she could think about was protecting the guard from what she perceived as harassment. "Hey!" Karen shouted loudly, her voice cutting through the laughter and chatter like a knife. Everyone turned to look at her, startled. For a brief second, she froze under the weight of so many eyes on her. But then she remembered why she was doing this. Stepping forward, she pointed the canister directly at the guard's face and pressed down without hesitation. A cloud of mist shot out, enveloping the soldier in an invisible haze. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people scrambled backward, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The teenagers who had been teasing the guard moments ago now looked terrified, their bravado melting away instantly. As for the guard himself, he blinked rapidly and flinched slightly. But astonishingly, he didn't break his stance. He remained rooted to the spot, his expression unreadable behind the sting of the spray. Karen, meanwhile, felt a rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. For a split second, she allowed herself to feel proud of her actions. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? She had protected someone who couldn't protect himself. But almost immediately, doubt began to creep in. Why weren't the other bystanders cheering? Why did everyone seem so shocked? And why were two uniformed officers suddenly rushing toward her, their faces stern and unsmiling? As reality started to sink in, Karen's confidence wavered. The officers stopped in front of her, blocking her path. One of them spoke firmly, asking her to explain what had just happened. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. She glanced back at the guard, who was now being attended to by his colleagues. His eyes watered slightly, but otherwise, he showed no sign of distress. If anything, he looked more composed than ever. That's when it hit her. The teenagers hadn't been harassing him at all. They were just having fun, playing along with the age-old tradition of trying to make the guards crack a smile. This was part of the experience, something tourists did all the time. The guard wasn't trapped or uncomfortable. He was simply doing his job, trained to ignore distractions, no matter how ridiculous they got. Karen realized, too late, that she had completely misread the situation. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment as the officers escorted her away from the scene. Tourists whispered among themselves, pointing fingers and shaking their heads. Some snapped photos of her, likely already uploading them to social media with captions like "American Woman Assaults Royal Guard." Karen wanted to disappear, to rewind time, and undo everything that had just happened. But there was no going back now. Her impulsive decision had consequences, and she was about to face them head-on. As Karen was led away from the scene by the two officers, her mind raced faster than her feet could move. She replayed the last few minutes in her head over and over again, trying to make sense of how everything had spiraled so out of control. One moment, she had been standing there, convinced she was doing the right thing. And the next, she was being treated like some sort of criminal. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, each beat reminding her of the gravity of what she'd done. The crowd around her seemed to blur into a sea of faces, all staring at her, with expressions ranging from disbelief to outright judgment. Some people whispered behind cupped hands, while others openly gawked, their phones still raised as if capturing her humiliation on camera would somehow make it more real. A teenager nearby muttered something about crazy Americans, loud enough for Karen to hear. The words stung, but she couldn't blame them. She felt just as bewildered by her own actions as everyone else did. The officers guided her toward a quieter corner of Trafalgar Square, away from the commotion. One of them asked her to hand over the pepper spray, his tone firm but not unkind. Karen complied without hesitation, her fingers trembling as she dropped the small canister into his outstretched palm. For the first time since arriving in London, she felt completely powerless. The pep talk she had given herself earlier, that she was protecting someone who needed help, now sounded absurd even to her own ears. What had she been thinking? "Ma'am, we need you to explain your actions," one of the officers said, pulling out a notepad. His voice was calm, almost clinical, but it carried an undertone of authority that made Karen's stomach churn. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. How could she possibly justify spraying a member of the Royal Guard? It sounded ridiculous, even to her. Finally, she managed to choke out a response. I thought he was being harassed," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Those kids, they were poking him and shouting at him. I thought he needed help." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, and Karen braced herself for a scolding, or worse. But instead, he simply nodded, jotting down notes in silence. "Do you understand what you've done here?" he asked after a pause. His question hung heavy in the air, forcing Karen to confront the truth she had been avoiding. She nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I made a mistake, a really big one." The officer sighed, his expression softening slightly. "This isn't just anyone you sprayed, ma'am. That's a member of the Queen's Guard. Assaulting a royal guard is a serious offense under British law." The weight of his words hit Karen like a ton of bricks. Serious offense. She hadn't considered the legal implications of her actions. In her panic, she hadn't stopped to think about the rules or traditions she might be breaking. All she had seen was a man she believed was in trouble, and now, because of her impulsiveness, she was in deep trouble herself. For the first time, Karen allowed herself to truly look at the situation from the outside. To everyone else, she wasn't a hero stepping in to save the day. She was a reckless tourist who had violated a sacred tradition. The guards weren't ordinary soldiers. They were symbols of pride and history, respected not only in Britain but around the world. And yet, she had treated one of them like any random person on the street, subjecting him to something as undignified as pepper spray. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had acted out of a desire to protect, only to cause harm instead. As the officers continued questioning her, Karen struggled to hold back tears. Every question felt like another layer of shame peeling away, exposing the full extent of her blunder. They asked for her identification, which she fumbled to retrieve from her wallet. They inquired about her intentions, prompting her to recount the events leading up to the incident. With each answer, Karen grew more aware of how misguided her actions had been. She wasn't just embarrassed, she was mortified. By the time they finished taking her statement, Karen's initial shock had given way to a sinking feeling of regret. She glanced back toward the square, where the guard was now being tended to by his colleagues. Despite everything, he still stood tall, his composure unshaken. Watching him, Karen felt a pang of admiration mixed with guilt. He had handled the entire ordeal with grace, while she had let her emotions get the better of her. If anything, he should have been the one upset, not her. As the officers informed her that she would need to accompany them to a nearby station for further processing, Karen nodded numbly. There was no point in arguing or resisting. She knew she deserved whatever consequences came her way. Still, a small part of her. The walk to the police station felt like an eternity for Karen. Each step weighed heavily on her, not just physically but emotionally. The bustling streets of London, once vibrant and exciting, now seemed cold and indifferent. Every passerby appeared to be staring at her, judging her, whispering about the American woman who pepper-sprayed a royal guard. Her cheeks burned with shame, and she couldn't help but replay the incident in her mind, searching for answers that weren't there. How had it come to this? She had started her day as a curious tourist eager to explore a new city, and now she was being treated like a criminal. When they arrived at the station, Karen was ushered into a small, sterile room. The walls were painted a dull gray, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the table where she sat. Two officers remained with her, one taking notes while the other asked questions in a calm but firm tone. They wanted to know everything: why she carried pepper spray, what made her think the guard needed protection, and whether she understood the seriousness of her actions. Karen answered truthfully, her voice trembling as she explained how she had misinterpreted the situation. "I thought he was trapped," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know they weren't bothering him. I swear I didn't mean any harm." Her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. No matter how sincere her intentions might have been, the fact remained that she had acted recklessly. The officers exchanged glances again, their expressions unreadable. One of them leaned forward slightly, his voice softening just enough to make Karen feel marginally less cornered. "Ma'am, we understand you didn't mean to cause trouble," he said, "but assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard is no small matter. This isn't just about breaking a law. It's about showing respect for traditions that go back centuries. Do you understand?" Karen nodded furiously, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her jacket. "Yes, I do," she replied, her voice barely audible. "I messed up. I didn't know. I didn't think." Her words trailed off as fresh sobs overtook her. For the first time in years, she felt utterly powerless, unable to fix or explain away the chaos she had created. As the questioning continued, Karen learned more about the potential consequences of her actions. Assaulting a royal guard could lead to criminal charges, hefty fines, and possibly even deportation. The thought of leaving London under such humiliating circumstances sent another wave of panic through her. What would her family think? How would her husband react when he found out? And what about her son, who idolized her as his strong, capable mother? The weight of these questions pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Midway through the process, Karen's phone rang. It was her husband, calling from his meeting. One of the officers handed her the device, allowing her to answer. When she heard his familiar voice on the other end, Karen broke down completely. Between sobs, she managed to tell them what had happened. At first, there was silence on the line, a shocked, bewildered kind of silence that made Karen wish she could disappear. Then came the inevitable question: "You did what?" Her husband's tone shifted from disbelief to concern as Karen recounted the details. He listened patiently, offering reassurance when she needed it most. "We'll figure this out," he told her firmly, though she could hear the tension in his voice. "Just stay calm and cooperate with the authorities." His words provided some comfort, but they couldn't erase the knot of dread forming in her stomach. No amount of cooperation could undo what she had done. After hanging up, Karen sat quietly, staring at the table in front of her. The officers gave her a moment to compose herself before explaining the next steps. Depending on the severity of the case and the guard's regiment's decision, charges might be filed, or they might choose to let her off with a warning. Either way, Karen knew she had work to do if she wanted to salvage the situation. She owed it to the guard, to her family, and to herself to take responsibility for her actions. As the hours dragged on, Karen began drafting an apology in her head. She imagined writing a letter to the regiment, expressing her deep regret and acknowledging her ignorance. She resolved to educate herself about British culture and traditions so she'd never make such a mistake again. These thoughts gave her a sliver of hope amidst the storm of guilt and fear swirling inside her. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to turn this disaster into something meaningful. But for now, all she could do was wait and pray for a chance to make things right. The hours at the police station stretched on, each minute feeling heavier than the last. Karen sat in the same gray room, her hands clasped tightly together to stop them from trembling. The officers had finished their initial questioning and left her alone for a while, saying they needed to consult with higher authorities about how to proceed. Alone with her thoughts, Karen tried to steady her breathing, but her mind kept racing. She replayed every detail of the day, the laughter of the teenagers, the stoic guard, the gasps of the crowd, and finally, the stunned expressions of the officers who escorted her away. It was all so surreal, like she had stepped into someone else's story. When one of the officers returned, his demeanor was different, less formal, almost sympathetic. He slid a piece of paper across the table toward her. "We've contacted the regiment," he said. "They're considering your case." Karen's heart sank. Considering sounded ominous, as though her fate hung precariously in the balance. Would they press charges? Would she be banned from returning to the UK? Or worse, would this incident follow her home, plastered across news outlets and social media? "They understand that your intentions weren't malicious," the officer continued, offering a small measure of reassurance. "But you need to show genuine remorse if you want any leniency." He explained that writing an apology letter directly to the regiment might help demonstrate her sincerity. Karen nodded eagerly, grateful for even the smallest opportunity to make amends. With pen and paper provided by the officers, Karen began drafting her letter. At first, her words came haltingly, awkward and stiff. But as she wrote, her emotions poured onto the page. She started by apologizing profusely, not just for spraying the guard, but for misunderstanding the situation entirely. "I acted out of ignorance and haste," she wrote, her handwriting shaky. "I mistook harmless fun for harassment and let my emotions override reason. I deeply regret my actions and take full responsibility for the harm I caused." She went on to express her admiration for the Royal Guards, acknowledging their discipline and dedication to tradition. "You stand tall as symbols of pride and history," she wrote, "and instead of respecting that, I disrespected it. For that, I am truly sorry." She promised to educate herself about British culture and traditions, vowing never to repeat such a mistake. By the time she signed her name at the bottom of the page, tears had smudged some of the ink, but her message was clear. She meant every word. Once the letter was complete, Karen handed it to the officers, who reviewed it briefly before nodding approvingly. "This is a good start," one of them said. "Now we'll see how the regiment responds." They assured her that she wouldn't be detained overnight, but emphasized that she needed to remain available for further communication. With that, Karen was released from the station, free to return to her hotel, but not without a heavy reminder of the seriousness of her actions. Back at the hotel, Karen collapsed onto the edge of her bed, exhausted both physically and emotionally. Her husband called again as soon as she walked in, his voice filled with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Karen shook her head, even though he couldn't see her. "No," she admitted. "I've never felt so stupid in my life." She recounted everything that had happened at the station, including the letter she'd written. To her relief, her husband didn't scold her or lecture her. Instead, he listened patiently, offering words of encouragement. "You did the right thing by owning up to it," he told her. "Now we just have to wait and see what happens next." That night, sleep eluded Karen. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the guard's face, or rather, his unwavering composure as the pepper spray hit him. She wondered if he harbored resentment toward her, or if he understood that her actions stemmed from a misguided attempt to help. She also thought about the regiment's response. Would they accept her apology, or would they demand stricter consequences? As dawn broke over London, Karen made a decision. If given the chance, she would go above and beyond to make things right. She would attend cultural sensitivity workshops, volunteer in community programs, and do whatever it took to prove that she had learned from her mistake. Until then, all she could do was wait and hope that her heartfelt apology would be enough to mend the bridge she had unintentionally burned. The days following Karen's release from the police station were a blur of anxiety and self-reflection. She spent most of her time holed up in her hotel room, avoiding eye contact with other tourists and dreading the possibility of running into another royal guard. Each knock on the door or ring of her phone sent her heart racing, convinced it was news about charges being filed or worse, a summons to appear in court. But as the hours turned into days, something unexpected happened. Silence. No one called to press charges, no official documents arrived in the mail, and the media frenzy she had feared never materialized. It was almost as if the world had moved on, leaving Karen alone with her guilt. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, an envelope arrived at the hotel addressed to her. Her hands trembled as she opened it, half expecting to find a formal complaint or legal notice inside. Instead, she discovered a letter from the regiment responsible for the guard she had pepper-sprayed. The tone was measured but surprisingly compassionate. They acknowledged receipt of her apology and expressed appreciation for her sincerity. While they made it clear that her actions were unacceptable, they also recognized that she had acted out of ignorance rather than malice. In light of your remorse and willingness to learn, the letter read, "We have decided not to pursue criminal charges against you. However, we strongly urge you to take steps to educate yourself and others about cultural sensitivity." To Karen's immense relief, they suggested a path forward: volunteering in programs aimed at promoting awareness of British traditions and customs. If she completed a set number of community service hours, the matter would be considered resolved. Karen couldn't believe her luck, or perhaps her second chance. For the first time since the incident, she felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just an opportunity to make amends. It was a chance to grow, to transform her mistake into something meaningful. Determined not to waste it, Karen threw herself into the task ahead. She reached out to local organizations in London that focused on cultural education and quickly found a program willing to accept her help. Over the next few weeks, she assisted in workshops designed to teach visitors about British history, etiquette, and the significance of institutions like the Royal Guards. At first, Karen was nervous about stepping back into public spaces. What if someone recognized her? What if they judged her for what she had done? But to her surprise, people were more curious than critical. When she shared her story during one workshop, admitting her error and explaining how she planned to learn from it, the audience responded with empathy rather than ridicule. Some even thanked her for her honesty, saying her experience served as a valuable lesson in thinking before acting. As the weeks went by, Karen noticed a change within herself. She no longer saw her trip to London as a disaster. Instead, it became a turning point. She devoured books about British culture, attended lectures, and even befriended locals who patiently answered her endless questions. Slowly but surely, she began to understand the depth and richness of the traditions she had once dismissed as mere tourist attractions. More importantly, she realized how easy it was to misinterpret situations when you approached them through the lens of your own assumptions. Her newfound knowledge didn't stop at British culture, though. Karen returned home with a renewed passion for learning about other countries and their customs. She started giving talks at schools and libraries, sharing her story not as a cautionary tale of embarrassment, but as a reminder of the importance of empathy and understanding. Her message resonated deeply with audiences, especially parents and students, who appreciated her candor and vulnerability. By the time months had passed, Karen's life looked vastly different from the way it had before her ill-fated encounter in Trafalgar Square. She had gone from being a well-meaning but misguided tourist to becoming an advocate for cultural awareness. And while she still cringed whenever she thought about that day, she also felt grateful for the lessons she had learned, the bridges she had rebuilt, and the person she had become because of it all. Months after her return to Ohio, Karen's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. What began as a humiliating mistake had evolved into a mission, a personal crusade to turn her misstep into something positive. She poured her energy into promoting cultural sensitivity, speaking at schools, community centers, and even local businesses about the importance of understanding and respecting differences. Her talks were candid and heartfelt, often beginning with the story of how she had pepper-sprayed a royal guard in London. "I'm not proud of what I did," she would say, standing before an audience of wide-eyed listeners. "But sometimes, our biggest mistakes become our greatest teachers." She went on to explain how her impulsive actions had stemmed from ignorance and misplaced protectiveness, emphasizing the dangers of jumping to conclusions without fully understanding a situation. Her vulnerability resonated deeply with people. Parents nodded in agreement, students scribbled notes, and teachers invited her back for repeat sessions. Word of Karen's advocacy spread quickly, earning her recognition beyond her small suburban town. Local newspapers featured her story, portraying her not as a reckless tourist, but as someone who had taken responsibility for her actions and used them as a catalyst for growth. The same media outlets that might have once ridiculed her now praised her efforts, calling her a champion of cultural awareness. Even the British Embassy in the United States reached out to commend her for her commitment to learning and sharing knowledge about their traditions. Karen didn't stop there. Inspired by her experience, she began collaborating with travel agencies and educational organizations to develop resources for tourists heading abroad. She created simple guides titled "Respect Before You Roam," filled with tips on navigating foreign cultures respectfully. These included reminders like researching local customs, asking questions instead of making assumptions, and always approaching unfamiliar situations with an open mind. Travel groups loved the initiative, incorporating her materials into pre-trip orientations for clients. Her work also brought unexpected opportunities. One day, she received an invitation to speak at a global conference focused on fostering cross-cultural understanding. The event was set to take place in none other than London, the very city where her infamous incident had occurred. At first, Karen hesitated. Returning to the scene of her blunder felt daunting, almost surreal. But deep down, she knew it was the perfect opportunity to close the chapter on her journey of redemption. When the day of the conference arrived, Karen stood backstage, clutching her notes tightly. Her heart raced as she peeked through the curtains at the sea of attendees gathered in the Grand Hall. Among them were diplomats, educators, and travelers from around the world, all united by a shared goal of bridging cultural divides. As her name was announced, and she stepped onto the stage, a wave of applause washed over her. It wasn't mockery or judgment. It was genuine appreciation. Karen took a deep breath and began her speech. 2 years ago, I made a decision that changed my life forever, she said, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. I let fear and misunderstanding cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I disrespected a tradition older than my own country. But today, I stand here not as a symbol of failure, but as proof that we can grow from our mistakes. She went on to share her journey, her regret, her education, and her transformation. By the time she finished, the room erupted in applause. People lined up afterward to thank her, many sharing their own stories of cultural misunderstandings and how her message had inspired them to approach such moments differently. For Karen, it was validation that her efforts had made a difference, not just for herself, but for others too. The trip wasn't complete without one final act of closure. On her last day in London, Karen returned to Trafalgar Square. The familiar buzz of tourists surrounded her as she approached the spot where everything had happened. Standing tall nearby was a royal guard, his red tunic gleaming under the sunlight. This time, Karen didn't rush toward him or assume anything. Instead, she paused respectfully at a distance, taking in the scene with newfound appreciation. After a moment, she whispered softly, though only she could hear it, "Thank you for teaching me patience, grace, and the value of second chances." Then, with a quiet smile, she turned and walked away, leaving behind a piece of her past while carrying forward the lessons that would shape her future. Karen's journey didn't end with her emotional visit to Trafalgar Square or the standing ovation she received at the global conference. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by shame or regret, but by purpose and growth. When she returned home to Ohio, she brought back more than memories. She carried with her a renewed sense of direction. Her experience in London had ignited a passion that continued to burn brightly, fueling her efforts to educate others about the importance of cultural awareness. Back in her community, Karen became a familiar face at local schools, libraries, and community centers. Teachers welcomed her into classrooms, knowing her story would captivate students and leave a lasting impression. She often started her talks by holding up a small canister of pepper spray, the very one she had used that fateful day, and saying, "This taught me a lesson I'll never forget." The kids would giggle nervously, but they listened intently as she recounted her misstep and explained how it led her to rethink how we treat people from different backgrounds. Her message resonated far beyond the younger generation. Adults, too, were inspired by her honesty and determination to turn a negative into a positive. Local businesses invited her to conduct workshops for employees traveling internationally, helping them prepare for interactions in foreign countries. Even seasoned travelers admitted they had learned valuable insights from Karen's experiences. "I thought I knew everything about being respectful," one businessman told her after a session. "But hearing your story made me realize there's always room to grow." As word of her advocacy spread, Karen began receiving invitations from organizations across the country. From New York to California, she traveled extensively, speaking at conferences, universities, and cultural festivals. Each event gave her an opportunity to connect with diverse audiences and share her belief that mistakes, no matter how embarrassing, could lead to meaningful change. People admired her courage, not just for owning up to her error, but for using it as a platform to inspire others. Her family noticed the transformation as well. Her teenage son, who once teased her for being overly cautious, now proudly introduced her to his friends as the mom who messed up big time, but fixed it even bigger. Her husband joked that she was becoming famous, though he couldn't hide his pride when strangers approached her in public to thank her for her work. For Karen, these moments served as reminders that her actions, both past and present, had touched lives in ways she hadn't anticipated. Years later, Karen found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed since that chaotic day in London. What had started as a moment of panic and poor judgment had blossomed into a fulfilling mission. She often wondered what might have happened if things had gone differently, if the regiment had pressed charges or if she had refused to take responsibility. Would she still be the same person? Probably not, she realized. That single decision to apologize and learn had set her on a path she couldn't have imagined. One afternoon, while sorting through old files, Karen stumbled upon a keepsake she hadn't seen in years. The letter from the Royal Guards Regiment accepting her apology. Rereading it brought tears to her eyes, not out of sadness, but gratitude. It reminded her of the compassion shown to her during her lowest moment, and how that kindness had given her the strength to move forward. Inspired, she decided to write a follow-up letter to the regiment, thanking them again for their understanding and updating them on the impact their leniency had made. To her delight, they responded warmly, expressing pride in the way she had turned her experience into something constructive. They even invited her to visit their barracks during her next trip to London, a gesture that filled her with awe and humility. Though nervous, Karen accepted, eager to meet the men and women whose dedication to tradition had unknowingly shaped her journey. When she finally stood among them, shaking hands and sharing stories, Karen felt a profound sense of closure. These soldiers weren't just symbols of history. They were individuals with stories, discipline, and resilience. As she left the barracks that day, she whispered another quiet thank you. This time, not just for forgiveness, but for the lessons they represented. Looking back, Karen knew her life had been forever altered by that split-second decision in Trafalgar Square. But instead of letting it define her as a failure, she had chosen to let it redefine her as someone committed to growth, empathy, and understanding. And in doing so, She proved that even the biggest mistakes could lead to the most beautiful beginnings.